Welcome to this deep dive. I am so thrilled you could join us today because we are embarking on an exploration that is, well, it's going to fundamentally change the way you interact with the physical world around you.
Really is.
Yeah. Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are looking at something so omnipresent that it has basically become entirely invisible to us. Yet, these invisible forces shape human history in ways we rarely notice.
Right. We just walk right through it every day.
Exactly. I want you to hold on to a seemingly impossible premise as we begin this. A localized muddy drought in the deserts of Africa can, through a series of relentless mechanical steps, eventually produce a hurricane in Florida,
Woohoo.
revealing how planetary systems quietly link distant places.
It sounds like magical realism when you frame it exactly like that, but it is the literal physical reality of the planet we inhabit.
And addressing that disconnect is really the mission of today's deep dive. I mean, the modern world often treats weather as a local event,
Right. You look at your window.
Yeah, you experience rain in one region or wind in another or a sudden heat wave, and you just think of them as isolated incidents, local anomalies. But today we are going to pull back the curtain on the global atmospheric system.
We are going to see that the weather is not just a series of random disconnected events.
It's a perfectly logical, relentlessly interconnected planetary engine.
A giant machine.
Exactly. And this deep dive explores the book Windswept, the story of wind and weather by Marq de Villiers, as an entry point into this global atmospheric system. It's this planetary network of circulating energy that connects climate, geography, and human civilization.
It is a remarkable piece of source material, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, wind isn't just moving air.
Right.
That is the simplest, most reductive way to look at it. Wind functions as the atmosphere's primary transport mechanism. It is a system that is ceaselessly striving to balance out the Earth's thermodynamic imbalances.
The incentive structure of this system is not a human intention.
No, not at all. It's thermodynamic imbalance. The Earth constantly attempts to equalize energy differences created by solar heating.
And wind becomes the vehicle it uses to pursue that equilibrium.
Precisely.
So before we get lost in the clouds, a quick housekeeping note. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
And for a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
Yep. And if you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next. Okay, let's get into it. You mentioned the planet trying to balance its thermodynamic imbalances. What does that actually look like on the ground?
Let's trace the butterfly effect in action.
Let's look at the birth of a very specific storm. We are in Darfur, Sudan, in the spring of 2004.
A region that was already enduring profound human suffering.
Right. Decades of civil war, massive displacement. And geographically, it sits right on the southeastern fringes of the Sahara Desert.
And at this specific time, they were in the middle of an immense, punishing 15-year drought.
The details in the text are just harrowing. I mean, refugees in the camps were rationing water to a degree that is frankly difficult to fathom.
An entire family would have to survive for a full 24 hours on an amount of water that could fit inside a single ostrich egg.
An ostrich egg.
Yeah.
For a whole family. And we have to consider the physical state of the earth itself under those conditions.
Yes. The soil in the Sahel, beaten down by too many cattle and too many goats over those 15 years of drought, had become baked into this concrete-like crust.
It had lost its natural porosity.
It simply could not absorb moisture anymore.
So when the rains finally did come, it wasn't a gentle soaking.
No, the ground just repelled it.
The water pooled on the surface and quickly gathered into these sudden muddy torrents. These flash floods began sweeping away the scattered huts in the countryside.
People who had literally been dying of thirst mere days earlier were suddenly scrambling to keep their meager possessions from washing away in a muddy deluge.
And this wasn't an isolated downpour. All along the southern fringe of the Sahara, the rains arrived. Lake Chad, which had been steadily shrinking into a puddle for decades, suddenly stopped shrinking.
The remaining channels where hippos lived, winding through the papyrus reeds, actually filled up.
The visual transformation of the landscape was staggering. The dusty, arid plains north of Kano in Nigeria suddenly looked lush.
Outside the fabled city of Timbuktu, the barren ground took on a shiny green sheen of new vegetation.
Well, at least until the local goats arrived and trampled those new green shoots back into the mud.
Right. But to the people living there, this was a profound blessing. They had absolutely no reason to look beyond the immediate relief of a 15-year drought finally breaking.
But someone else was watching, right? And they weren't celebrating at all.
Far from it. This is where we see the ultimate lesson in interconnected natural systems. While the locals were celebrating the water, there were professionals thousands of miles away watching those exact same green shoots with a sense of impending dread.
We're talking about risk analysts, paranoid actuaries at the giant reinsurance company Munich Re, and meteorologists sitting in hurricane centers across the Atlantic.
They were monitoring this African rainfall because they understood that this sudden, massive influx of moisture in the Sahel was fundamentally altering the atmospheric pressure gradients over the entire continent.
I want to pause on that because it's such a wild concept. An insurance actuary sitting in an office in Europe is terrified by a puddle forming in an African desert.
It sounds absurd until you see the math.
How does that puddle actually turn into a threat? Walk me through the anatomy of this storm's journey. It starts near a specific mountain, doesn't it?
Yes, the Emikusi Mountain. It's a dormant shield volcano in the Tobesti Mountains of the Central Sahara. You have the immense hot breath of the desert floor flinging itself against the physical barrier of this mountain.
And as this superheated air is forced up the slopes,
What meteorologists call anabatic wind.
right, anabatic wind, it scales rapidly into the upper troposphere, but simultaneously you have cooler, denser air flowing downward from the high altitude.
We're known as katabatic wind.
So you have a high-speed collision of boiling hot air rushing up and freezing cold air rushing down.
Precisely. And that violent friction creates massive, towering thunderheads. The sheer mechanical force of these colliding air masses spins off localized tornadoes that twist through the mountain ravines.
It is a crucible of atmospheric violence.
And then it starts to move.
The prevailing easterly winds catch this massive cluster of thunderheads and start pushing it west across the continent. The text has this incredible detail about how this movement was recorded. There's a guy named Bandiougu Diallo,
The lone weatherman stationed in Timbuktu.
a phenomenal example of human observation before the era of ubiquitous satellite data. He isn't sitting behind a bank of supercomputers.
No, he is observing the weather the old-fashioned, visceral way.
During this massive thunderstorm, he is literally standing on the roof of his weather office, physically eyeballing the extent of the cloud cover.
He is hoisting a handheld anemometer, a wind meter, into the air to measure the gusts.
And he logs violent downdrafts hitting 60 miles an hour. He writes these observations down in a handwritten logbook, forwarding the notes to his regional bosses simply to warn local bush pilots.
But those handwritten, localized observations are eventually aggregated into global atmospheric databanks. They become a single data point in tracking a massive system.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this specific cluster of African thunderstorms, born from the end of a long drought and measured by a guy on a roof in Timbuktu, eventually drifts off the west coast of Africa.
It leaves the land and hits the open ocean.
And the book notes it passes south of the Cape Verde Islands. Why is that specific geographical location so dangerous?
Because of the ocean currents, that specific area is where the storm system encounters the Canary Current, and at that particular time, the surface water temperature of that current was precisely 28.8 degrees Celsius.
Or about 84 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners?
Yeah.
Is that a magic number for storms?
It is the threshold of catastrophe. For a tropical depression to evolve into a hurricane, it requires a sea surface temperature of at least 26.5 degrees Celsius.
So 28.8 is a massive reservoir of thermal energy.
Yes. But the warm water alone isn't enough. The conditions in the upper atmosphere also have to be perfect. In this case, the high-altitude winds were eerily calm. There was no wind shear.
Wind shear being the crosswinds that would normally blow the top off a developing storm.
Exactly. If you have strong, high-altitude winds, they decapitate the thunder cells before they can organize. But here, the upper atmosphere was still.
So taking these two conditions together,
The 28.8-degree water and the lack of wind shear.
it's like taking the heavy lid off a massive pot of boiling water. The hot, moisture-laden air right at the surface of the ocean begins to ascend rapidly, unhindered.
And as it rises, it cools down and condenses. It turns from water vapor back into liquid water drops and ice crystals.
Yes. As it reaches about 2.4 miles up into the atmosphere, that condensation occurs. But here is the critical thermodynamic engine of a hurricane. The active condensation releases heat.
Wait, really? I always think of condensation as a cooling process, like water beating on the outside of cold glass.
It cools the object it forms on, but the phase change itself releases energy into the surrounding air. When water evaporates from the ocean, It absorbs heat energy to turn into a gas.
Ah,
When it condenses back into a liquid high in the atmosphere, it has to release that stored energy. It's called latent heat. And the scale of this energy release is staggering. The text provides a brilliant metric for this to help us visualize it.
I remember this. It said a single kilogram of water condensing in the atmosphere releases enough latent heat to bring half a liter of room temperature water to a rolling boil.
Now multiply that single kilogram by the billions of tons of water vapor rising from the tropical Atlantic Ocean every hour.
This liberated energy violently reheats the surrounding air at high altitudes.
Because hot air expands and rises, this reheated air drives even further upward into the stratosphere.
And that creates a vacuum underneath it.
Precisely. As the air forcefully evacuates the space below, the atmospheric pressure at the surface drops precipitously. This low-pressure void acts like a planetary-scale vacuum cleaner.
It violently sucks in more warm, moist surface air from the surrounding ocean.
That new air rises, condenses, releases more latent heat, rises further, drops the pressure even more, and sucks in even more air.
It's a self-feeding loop, a runaway train.
It is a massive thermodynamic engine that will endlessly feed on itself, growing larger and more violent as long as it has an unbroken supply of warm water to consume.
And the spin, because storms don't just go straight up, they rotate.
That is the Coriolis force at work, which we will explore in much greater depth later. But essentially, the rotation of the Earth deflects the incoming surface winds, causing them to spiral inward toward the low-pressure center rather than flowing straight in.
This spiraling creates the eye and the recognizable vortex structure of the hurricane.
And this specific vortex, born from the dust of Darfur, became Hurricane Ivan in 2004, one of the most destructive hurricanes on record. I want you, the listener, to pause and really internalize the wild reality of this.
It's staggering to think about.
Imagine someone sitting in a rural tavern in Pennsylvania or a family having dinner in their living room in Florida, completely oblivious to the rest of the world. They have no idea that their roof is about to be physically torn off their house or their neighborhood is about to be submerged in floodwaters, specifically because a 15-year drought happened to end in the Sahara Desert a few weeks earlier.
It shatters the illusion of local weather entirely.
It profoundly destabilizes our sense of isolation. It forces us to confront the fact that we are deeply, physically, and violently connected to places we may never visit through a medium we cannot even see.
And it's important to understand how profoundly unnatural this systems-level view feels to the human brain.
We are simply not biologically wired to see the atmosphere as a global engine. For the vast majority of human history, we didn't have weather satellites or Doppler radar or supercomputers modeling thermal dynamics.
We just had our immediate surroundings. We had our five senses in the sky above us. Which brings us to the human connection, how we historically dealt with this invisible force before we had the tools to understand it.
Because before we could track pressure gradients across the Atlantic, wind wasn't a thermodynamic process. Wind was personal, and often it was terrifying.
The author shares a very harrowing childhood anecdote that perfectly illustrates this visceral pre-scientific fear. He grew up in Sea Point, a suburb of Cape Town, South Africa, situated right near the fabled Cape of Storms.
And geographically, that's a highly volatile place, right?
Extremely. It is the juncture where two massive oceanic forces meet. You have the frigid Benguela Current flowing up from the Antarctic, colliding directly with the warm Agulhas Current sweeping down from the Indian Ocean.
The collision of these two radically different bodies of water creates massive temperature differentials in the air above them.
Which, as we've established, means the atmosphere is desperately trying to balance those temperatures out.
Yes. And the result of that balancing act is the generation of massive, violent pulses of disturbed air. It creates gales that race across the Cape Peninsula with terrifying, almost physical force.
And the author describes a day from his childhood that encapsulates this. He was a small child, playing on a spacious, manicured lawn right near the seawall. And suddenly, without any warning, the wind simply seized him.
It physically knocked him down onto the grass. He notes that it felt gratuitous and brutal, like he was being attacked.
He struggled to his feet and yelled for his mother to help him, but the gale was so strong it literally snatched the breath from his mouth and blew the sound of his voice out to sea.
He calls it a soundless scream.
A deeply traumatic sensory experience for a child.
Then another gust punched him back to the ground. It buffeted him across the grass, rolling him like a tumbleweed until he finally smashed against the metal railings at the very edge of the breakwater.
And right below those railings were jagged rocks covered in sharp barnacles and pounding, freezing ocean breakers.
He was trapped against the metal, unable to stand until his mother fought through the wind to rescue him, pressing him against her chest to calm his absolute primal terror.
For that child in that moment, the wind wasn't a thermodynamic mechanism balancing the Earth's energy intake. It was a monster. It was an invisible beast trying to throw him into the ocean.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly that specific childhood trauma mirrors the broader pre-scientific human experience.
Right.
Without systems thinking, without the empirical knowledge that a storm is born thousands of miles away due to barometric pressure differentials, storms simply appeared out of nowhere.
The sky would darken without warning, the temperature would plummet, and an invisible, overwhelming physical force would arrive to rip your house apart, sink your fishing boat, or flatten the crops you needed to survive the winter.
And if you don't know why it's happening, human nature dictates that you assume it's happening to you. You assume intent.
Precisely. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine. When we encounter chaos, we desperately try to impose narrative upon it. This lack of context made the wind feel inherently malevolent. It felt angry, targeted, and above all, arbitrary.
It's no wonder that ancient humans universally personified the wind. They conflated the wind with the divine. And because the wind was so ferocious and changeable, those wind gods were generally depicted as angry, short-tempered dictators who needed to be appeased.
The mythology surrounding wind globally is just incredible to look at. Different cultures all over the planet, separated by oceans, all attempted to explain this invisible force in such wonderfully creative yet structurally similar ways.
It became a foundational element of almost all human creation myths. Because the wind dictated weather, it also governed commerce, communication, travel, and agricultural procreation. It was the ultimate arbiter of life and death.
For instance, let's look at the Dogon people of Mali in West Africa. Their cosmology teaches that the winds, and breath itself, originally came from the mouths of the four founding couples of humanity.
It intimately ties the physical movement of the air to the very essence of human life.
And in North America, the Mi'kmaq people of the Atlantic coast have a very different narrative structure. They tell stories of a hero named Glooskap. In their tradition, the wind was not a god, but an animal, a massive, monstrous eagle.
The flapping of this eagle's wings was creating all the chaotic winds, making the world too violent and uninhabitable for humans.
So Glooskap had to seek out this eagle, conquer it, and physically imprison it to bring order to the weather.
He had to tie the wind down.
Yeah.
And then you have the Bozo people, who live on the southern fringes of the Sahara. They have a deeply elemental myth. They believe that in the dawn of time, wind literally wrestled with water.
It was a cosmic physical struggle.
And wind won. The result of that victory, the drying up of the water, was the creation of the Great Desert.
These myths are highly instructive. They weren't just primitive fairy tales. They were sophisticated psychological tools. They were a way to impose a narrative structure on absolute chaos.
If the wind is an eagle, or a wrestling match between elements, or the breath of ancestors, it has rules. It has a physical form of the imagination.
And if it has a form, it can potentially be bargained with or defeated or at least understood. It offers comfort in the face of the uncontrollable.
You see, it attempts to physically contain it in the myths, too. Homer wrote about Odysseus being gifted the four winds, tightly bound in a leather sack tied to the mast of his ship until his foolish crew opened it and blew them entirely off course.
Chinese mythology features a wind god who carried the winds in a massive bag slung over his back, releasing them only when he chose to.
So James George Fraser's seminal anthropological work, The Golden Bough, catalogs numerous instances of literal physical combat with the wind. He documents Aboriginal tribes lighting wooden brands on fire and running screaming at the wind to frighten it away.
Or communities attempting to push the winds back into mountain caves, rushing to roll massive boulders over the entrance to seal the gales inside.
The idea of fighting the wind with a flaming stick is both tragic and beautiful. But my absolute favorite historical anecdote regarding this need for control involves the Finnish wizards.
Back in the days of early sail, these wizards ran a very lucrative business selling knotted ropes to anxious mariners.
A fascinating blend of commerce and superstition. The system was simple but ingenious. You buy this magic rope. If your ship is becalmed, you untie the first knot. and the wizards guaranteed a gentle, favorable breeze.
If you needed to move faster, you untied the second knot for a stiff, robust wind.
If you were being chased by pirates, you untied the third knot for a heavy gale. But the fourth knot,
Well, you never ever untied the fourth knot unless you were prepared to die, because that knot would unleash a devastating hurricane on everyone in the ocean.
it perfectly highlights the deep psychological need for agency. The Finnish wizards were selling an illusion. By handing a sailor a knotted rope, you give them the feeling of a steering wheel in an environment where they are otherwise utterly powerless.
But eventually, as human civilization expanded, as trade routes lengthened and navigation became more critical, this mythological phase had to evolve. Relying on magic knots wasn't enough to sail across oceans consistently. They needed to map the wind.
But how do you map something you fundamentally believe is invisible or made of magic?
You have to start observing the patterns.
Exactly. We see a very slow, halting transition from myth to measurement. The ancient Greeks were pioneers in this empirical approach. They realized that merely identifying the four cardinal winds, north, south, east, west, was vastly insufficient for accurate Mediterranean navigation.
Because the wind almost never blows exactly from true north.
Right. They needed greater precision. So in the 1st century BC, the astronomer Andronicus of Cyrus built the Tower of the Winds in the Roman Agora of Athens.
It was an octagonal marble structure, essentially a giant meteorological station, featuring sundials, a water clock, and most importantly, a wind vane on the roof.
Each of the 8 sides faced a point of the compass and was decorated with a relief of the deity representing the wind from that specific direction. It was the physical marriage of mythology and early meteorological science.
And as centuries passed, that desire to categorize the chaos evolved into the windrows. The book mentions this appearing on the charts of Portuguese and Spanish mariners in the 13th century, right around the time they were starting to explore further down the coast of Africa.
Yes, they expanded the Greek 8-point system into the highly complex 32-point windrows. It diagrammed 8 major winds, 8 half winds, and 16 quarter winds.
Visually, drawn on vellum charts, it looked like the overlapping petals of a wild European rose, which is where it got its name. It was the direct precursor to the modern compass rose.
It was humanity's first real attempt to map the invisible forces pushing them around the globe. But here is the crazy part. Even with these beautiful, intricate maps, there was still a fundamental civilization-wide misunderstanding of what they were actually mapping.
Which brings us to a really fun question dissecting the invisible. What exactly is air? What is the atmosphere?
It is a question that took humanity an embarrassingly long time to answer correctly.
To illustrate how blind we were, the author shares a brilliant story about his cousin Colin. Colin was a young boy diving in the incredibly clear, pristine waters of the Indian Ocean off the coast of South Africa.
He's exploring the reefs, he manages to catch a clawless rock lobster, brings it up to the surface, and as he's holding it, he asks this completely out of nowhere, profoundly philosophical question.
He looks at his cousin and says, "If the crayfish can't see the water, and they look up from the bottom, do they think the fish are flying?"
It is a stunning observation. A child intuitively grasping the concept of relative perception, and it is the perfect analogy for our own existence on this planet.
We are the crayfish.
Think about it. We are walking around on the ground, looking up at seagulls and airplanes, completely oblivious to the fact that we are bottom feeders. We are living our entire lives at the very, very bottom of a towering, unbelievably heavy ocean of unseen fluid.
We just happen to call that fluid air.
Because we can't see it, and because we move through it so effortlessly, we rarely pause to consider its immense physical presence.
And historically, this invisibility was a massive, almost insurmountable stumbling block for the progress of science. For millennia, the brightest minds in human history literally thought air was nothing. They equated it with the void. It was empty space.
You couldn't taste it, you couldn't see it, and it didn't seem to have weight when you held out your hand.
So how do we finally figure out that nothing was actually something?
The first major conceptual breakthrough required a philosophical leap. Greek philosophers, particularly Anaximenes and later Aristotle, proposed that air was one of the fundamental elements, alongside earth, water, and fire. They argued that it was a physical substance capable of changing state.
But philosophizing that air is something is very different from proving what that something is composed of.
Because it's incredibly hard to study a subject you can't put in a jar and look at.
Precisely. To truly dissect the invisible, it required the invention of modern chemistry and the ability to isolate and measure gases. This didn't happen until the scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries.
Before that, there were deeply confused theories, like the phlogiston theory, which suggested combustible materials contained a fire-like element that was released into the air during burning.
So they thought fire was a physical substance hiding inside wood and the air just absorbed it?
Exactly. It wasn't until scientists started building intricate glass apparatuses to trap the gases released by chemical reactions that the truth emerged. Robert Boyle, an Anglo-Irish natural philosopher in the 1600s, was crucial here.
He forcefully questioned the ancient Aristotelian view of the four elements. He proposed that matter was composed of tiny particles, and he was the first to bring precise mathematical measurements to the volume and pressure of gases.
He proved that air had elasticity, that it could be compressed and expanded. If you can compress it, it must be made of physical matter.
It's physical stuff. And then we get to the actual recipe of the air.
Yes, the discovery that air wasn't a single uniform element, but a mixture. Henry Cavendish, a deeply eccentric but brilliant British scientist in the late 1700s, spent years isolating different airs.
Through painstaking experiments capturing gases over water and mercury, he eventually figured out the ratio. He proved that common atmospheric air was primarily made up of two distinct gases, what we now know as nitrogen and oxygen, in roughly a 4-to-1 ratio.
And Antoine Lavoisier helped codify all this, right?
Indeed. Lavoisier, the brilliant French chemist, took these discoveries, debunked the phlogiston theory entirely, and proved the role of oxygen in combustion and respiration. He laid out the modern notion of elements systematically.
Tragically, his scientific brilliance didn't save him from politics. He was arrested during the French Revolution and met his end on the guillotine during the Reign of Terror in 1794.
The mathematician Joseph Louis Lagrange famously lamented, "It took them only an instant to cut off his head, but France may not produce another like it in a century."
A dark end for the guy who finally proved we were swimming in a chemical soup.
Yeah.
But before Boyle and Cavendish and Lavoisier applied rigorous science, people had some wild theories about what was above our heads.
In the Middle Ages, there was a Benedictine abbess named Hildegard of Bingen. She was an incredible polymath, a composer, a philosopher, and a mystic who had these grand, sweeping visions of the cosmos.
And she believed that the universe was physically held together by 4 literal physical layers of wind, one for each cardinal direction, stacked like a celestial layer cake.
Her specific vision of cardinal winds stacking on top of each other was incorrect. But conceptually, Hildegard wasn't entirely wrong about the atmosphere having distinct stratified layers.
As our technology improved, as we launched weather balloons, sounding rockets, and eventually satellites, we discovered that the atmospheric shield protecting our planet is far more complex than a simple uniform blend of oxygen and nitrogen stretching out into space.
It's a highly structured shield. Let's break those layers down because it radically changes how you view the sky. The lowest layer, the one we live in as bottom feeders, is the troposphere.
Yes, the troposphere contains roughly 75 to 80% of the total mass of the planetary atmosphere and almost all of its water vapor. This is where the vast majority of clouds form and where all the phenomena we call weather occur.
It is surprisingly thin. It extends only about 5 miles high at the poles and bulges up to about 10 miles high at the equator due to thermal expansion.
Which means the entire realm of human existence, every storm, every flight, every bird, exists in a layer of air that is thinner than the distance most people commute to work.
And it gets incredibly cold up there, dropping to minus 60 degrees Celsius at the upper boundary. That's why when you're on a commercial flight cruising at 35,000 feet, the fuselage outside is freezing, even if you are flying directly over the sweltering equator.
Beyond the troposphere, we move into the stratosphere, the mesosphere, and then we reach the layers that interact not just with internal Earth dynamics, but with vast cosmic forces. For instance, the ionosphere, which sits in the upper reaches of the atmosphere.
I have to jump in here because the detail about the ionosphere in the book absolutely blew my mind. We always think of the atmosphere as just dictating weather, rain, wind, temperature. But the electromagnetic properties of the ionosphere might actually act as a literal early warning system for earthquakes.
It is one of the most remarkable areas of ongoing geophysical research. The ionosphere is filled with charged particles, ionized by solar radiation. Now, before a massive earthquake occurs, there is immense tectonic stress building up in the Earth's crust.
Grinding rocks deep underground.
Yes, and that grinding, that deformation of the crystalline structure of the rocks, generates powerful acoustic gravity waves, as well as low-frequency electromagnetic emissions. These signals don't just stay in the ground.
They propagate upward, traveling through the lower atmosphere until they hit the ionosphere. When they reach that charged layer, they cause measurable disturbances in the electron density.
So the sky is literally reacting to the stress in the ground days before the ground actually breaks.
Precisely. Researchers studying the data from the devastating 2004 Asian tsunami and earthquake found anomalous disturbances in the ionosphere up to 6 days before the main tremor hit.
If we can develop the technology and the algorithms to reliably read and interpret those atmospheric disturbances, the sky itself could give us days of warning before a catastrophic seismic event.
That could save hundreds of thousands of lives. The idea that we could predict earthquakes by looking at the upper atmosphere is the ultimate example of systems thinking.
But the layers don't stop there. Above the ionosphere, extending far out into space, is the magnetosphere. And this is what protects us from the solar wind.
To understand the magnetosphere, you have to picture the Earth not just as a ball of rock, but as a giant dynamo. Deep in the center of the planet is a spinning liquid outer core composed mostly of molten iron and nickel.
The convection currents within this spinning liquid metal generate a massive magnetic field that extends thousands of miles out into space. And we desperately need that field because our planet is constantly under brutal assault by the solar wind.
Let's clarify that term. When we hear solar wind, we think of a warm, gentle breeze made of light.
It is not a breeze. It's a violent, relentless stream of high-energy plasma, mostly electrons and protons, bleeding off the corona of the sun at 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Indeed, it is a torrent of radiation. The sun is essentially boiling away its own mass. The solar wind strips roughly 10 million tons of hydrogen and helium from the sun every single year and hurls it across the solar system.
And because the sun is rotating as it emits this plasma, the solar wind doesn't travel in a straight line. It spirals outward.
It hits the Earth in a massive curving shape that astrophysicists informally refer to as the sprinkler, because it mathematically resembles the curved streams of water shooting out of a spinning lawn sprinkler.
Okay, so you have this million-mile-an-hour wave of radioactive plasma slamming into the Earth. What happens when it hits the magnetic field?
It creates a bow shock, much like water flowing around the prow of a ship. When this high-speed, magnetized plasma slams into Earth's magnetic field, the impact physically squishes the sunward side of our magnetosphere, compressing it tightly against the planet.
But on the night side, the side facing away from the sun, the force of the solar wind drags the magnetic field out into a long, trailing teardrop shape known as the magnetotail. This tail stretches millions of miles out into the darkness of space.
So we're essentially flying through a hostile universe inside a massive, invisible magnetic windsock.
That is a very apt analogy. And we cannot overstate the importance of this structure. If we did not have that magnetic deflection, if our planetary core was made of cold rock or aluminum instead of spinning iron, that million-mile-an-hour solar wind would hit the atmosphere directly.
Over millions of years, the high-energy particles would systematically strip away our oxygen and nitrogen. The oceans would evaporate and be swept into space.
We would look exactly like Mars, a barren, irradiated rock.
Precisely. Mars lost its magnetic field billions of years ago, and the solar wind subsequently stripped away its atmosphere. So when you ask what the atmosphere is, you must realize it is not just a passive layer of air.
It is a dynamic, aggressively layered shield of inert gases, ionized particles, and vast magnetic fields, all constantly interacting with the immense, deadly power of the sun.
Which perfectly sets up the actual mechanics of the weather. We've talked about the shield, now let's talk about the planetary engine itself. Because if we trace the wind you feel on your face back to its ultimate source, we don't just find a high-pressure zone over the next state.
We eventually arrive at the nuclear furnace of the sun.
Everything about the Earth's climate begins with solar radiation. The sun is a main sequence star, and deep inside its core, the temperatures and pressures are so extreme that nuclear fusion occurs. Millions of hydrogen atoms are violently crashing together every nanosecond, fusing to create helium.
And here's the Einstein physics of it. Because 4 hydrogen atoms weigh slightly more than one resulting helium atom, that missing mass doesn't just disappear. The universe doesn't allow mass to vanish.
According to Einstein's famous equation, EMC2, that tiny fraction of missing mass converts directly into pure, unadulterated energy. And an unbelievable amount of that energy survives the 93 million mile journey to hit our planet.
The numbers are almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 175 trillion kilowatt hours of solar energy strike the Earth every single hour. To put that in perspective, that is more energy hitting the planet in 1 hour than the entire human race consumes in a full year.
And the atmosphere has to do something with all that energy.
It does. A significant portion is reflected back into space by clouds and ice. Another portion is absorbed by the oceans and land masses, warming the planet. A tiny fraction is captured by plants for photosynthesis. But somewhere between 1 and 2% of that vast incoming solar energy is converted directly into the kinetic energy of wind.
That doesn't sound like a lot, 1 or 2%.
It may sound small, but 1% of 175 trillion kilowatt hours is an astronomical figure. It means wind commands 50 to 100 times more raw energy than all the plants on Earth convert into biomass. Wind is the Earth's primary muscular method of managing this staggering influx of solar power.
But why does the wind have to blow at all? Why doesn't the Earth just absorb the heat evenly?
Because the Earth is a sphere, the distribution of that solar energy is drastically uneven. The equator, facing the sun directly, is getting blasted with concentrated, high-angle radiation. Meanwhile, the poles are receiving sunlight at a very shallow glancing angle, meaning the energy is spread out and much weaker. They are barely simmering.
So you have a boiling middle and freezing top and bottom.
And this is where the second law of thermodynamics takes over. Entropy. Nature absolutely abhors this kind of severe energy imbalance. In a closed system, if you have a highly concentrated zone of heat adjacent to a zone of freezing cold, the system will relentlessly attempt to reorder itself. It desperately seeks equilibrium. It wants a uniform temperature.
Wind is just the mechanism the Earth uses to try and equalize the pressure and temperature. It's moving the hot air away from the equator and dragging the cold air down from the poles.
Precisely. If entropy wasn't at work, driving the wind to redistribute the heat, the equatorial oceans would literally boil away. The higher latitudes would plunge into a permanent, absolute deep freeze, and the biosphere as we know it would cease to exist. Life relies on the wind to stir the pot.
So the planet is just trying to balance its checkbook.
Yeah.
But it's not a simple straight line, right? The hot air doesn't just rise at the equator and flow in a straight line north to the Arctic. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the Earth is spinning, and that spin messes everything up.
It introduces the Coriolis force,
Yeah.
which is perhaps the most misunderstood concept in popular meteorology.
Oh, I love the story the author tells about this. It's the perfect illustration of how easily we misunderstand planetary physics. He was traveling in Kenya, riding in the back of an aging, rattling Renault sedan. It was being driven by a rugged former game warden. And the author is sharing the tiny back seat with a massive, creaking python named Brenda, who kept shifting around and kept him awake all night.
A truly memorable, if uncomfortable, travel companion.
Right. So they finally arrive at the geographical equator near the town of Eldoret. They're exhausted, sleep-deprived, and fragile, and they pull over and join a busload of eager tourists who are gathered around to watch a local Maasai man demonstrate the Coriolis effect.
A classic tourist trap.
It's beautiful theater. The man has 2 buckets of water placed on the ground, exactly 1 yard on either side of the painted equator line. He steps over to the northern bucket, pulls the plug at the bottom, and drops a matchstick in so you can watch the flow. The water spirals out perfectly counterclockwise. Then he steps a yard over the line to the southern bucket, pulls the plug, and the water spirals out perfectly clockwise. The tourists are oohing and aahing, marveling at the power of planetary physics and handing over generous tips.
But as the author and the seasoned game warden immediately recognized, it was a complete hustle.
A total fraud. The guy was just pouring the water into the buckets from a specific angle to induce a pre-existing spin, and then pulling the plugs with a slight practiced twist of his wrist to force the direction of the vortex. Because on the microscopic scale of a bucket or a toilet bowl or a bathtub, the Coriolis effect is functionally non-existent.
That is correct. It is a myth that toilets flush in different directions in Australia versus America due to the planet's rotation. The angle of deflection at that tiny scale is roughly 1/3600th of a degree. The shape of the porcelain bowl or the angle of the water jets entirely overrides any planetary influence. To see the Coriolis effect naturally govern the drainage of a bathtub, you would need a bathtub the size of the Great Lakes, completely devoid of any internal currents or vibrations, left perfectly still for weeks.
So why does it matter for the wind?
Because while it doesn't affect a bucket, on a planetary scale, moving massive bodies of air over thousands of miles, the Coriolis force is arguably the single most important factor in shaping global weather patterns. The French mathematician Gustave Gaspard Coriolis first mathematically described this in 1835. The fundamental concept is that the Earth is a rotating frame of reference. The equator is spinning at roughly 1,000 miles per hour, while the poles are virtually stationary.
I always try to visualize this like a merry-go-round.
That is the perfect mental model. Imagine you are standing in the exact center of a spinning playground merry-go-round. Your friend is standing on the outer edge. If you try to roll a ball in a perfectly straight line toward your friend, the ball will appear to curve away from them.
Because by the time the ball gets to the edge, my friend is rotated away from that spot.
Exactly. The ball went straight, but the frame of reference moved underneath it. On Earth, any object moving freely across its surface, whether that's a long-range artillery shell, a commercial jetliner, or a continent-sized mass of air, will experience this apparent deflection. In the northern hemisphere, moving air is deflected to the right of its intended path. In the southern hemisphere, it is deflected to the left.
So going back to our planetary engine, the hot air at the equator rises. It wants to head straight north to cool off. But the spinning Earth physically yanks the ground out from under it, deflecting that massive river of air to the right.
Yes. And because of this constant deflection, the air cannot make a single, continuous journey from the equator to the pole. Instead, the global atmospheric circulation breaks down into three distinct, rotating latitudinal bands, or convection cells, in each hemisphere.
Let's map those out. Nearest the equator, you have the Hadley cells. The hot air rises, moves poleward, cools, and sinks around 30 degrees latitude. This sinking air creates the persistent high-pressure zones that are responsible for most of the world's great deserts: the Sahara, the Arabian, the Mojave.
And the horizontal surface winds, rushing back toward the equator to complete the Hadley cell, are deflected westward. These are the trade winds.
Precisely. The reliable easterly trade winds that allowed early European sailors to reliably cross the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Where these trade winds meet at the equator, the air is moving vertically upward, not horizontally. This creates a band of profound calm at the surface, historically dreaded by sailors as the doldrums. A ship could sit there for weeks, sail slack, baking in the sun.
Then you move further north into the mid-latitudes where we live.
Here you find the Ferrel cells. The surface winds in this zone are driven poleward and deflected to the east. These are the prevailing westerlies. They dominate the weather patterns for most of North America, Europe, and Asia. In the southern hemisphere, where there are very few land masses to create friction and slow them down, these westerlies howl unhindered across the open ocean. Mariners name them the Roaring Forties, the Furious Fifties, and the Screaming Sixties.
It paints such a vivid picture. We have these massive gears of wind churning around the planet, but it's not a smooth machine, is it? It's exactly where these different planetary belts grind against each other that life gets miserable for us. The mid-latitudes, where the Ferrel cell meets the polar cell, is a battleground.
It is a zone of perpetual conflict. You have the warm, moisture-laden subtropical air pushing north, constantly clashing against the dense, freezing polar air pushing south. And because these air masses have completely different densities, they don't easily mix. They slide over and under each other, creating vast, swirling frontal systems.
It creates this chaotic, swirling, completely patternless turbulence. It's why cities like New York or London or Chicago can experience a blinding blizzard one week and balmy peach-red sunshine the next. There is no consistency. The author quotes Mark Twain complaining about this exact phenomenon. Twain noted that New Englanders kill a lot of poets every year for writing rapturously about beautiful spring, because those poets are usually casual visitors who bring their idyllic notions of spring from somewhere else. New England spring is just mud and unpredictable freezing rain.
It's a highly volatile transitional zone, and this structural volatility perfectly bridges into the next crucial aspect of our deep dive: chaos, complexity, and the limits of prediction. Because despite possessing a firm understanding of the solar furnace, the Hadley cells, and the mathematics of the Coriolis force, predicting exactly what the weather will do in those specific mid-latitudes remains an incredibly difficult scientific challenge.
I think we all suffer from the illusion of perfect forecasting. We open an app on our phones, we see a cute little icon of a cloud with a lightning bolt, and we assume the science is settled. We know we have terabyte supercomputers crunching data. We have Doppler radar tracking rainfall down to the street level. We have fleets of satellites looking at every square inch of the globe. And yet, local weather forecasts are still fundamentally unreliable past a few days. If you look at a 5-day forecast, that 5th day is essentially an educated guess. Why is that? Why can we land a rover on a moving asteroid, but we can't tell if it will rain in Ohio next Thursday?
It raises an essential question about the nature of the systems we are trying to model. The atmosphere does not behave like the orbital mechanics of a planet. It behaves like a fluid. The American Meteorological Society once issued a defense of their profession that I think puts the sheer audacity of weather forecasting into proper perspective.
I love this quote. Lay it on me.
They asked the public to imagine trying to predict the exact behavior of a 25-mile-deep mixture of varying interacting gases. This gas mixture is wrapped around a bumpy, topographically complex sphere that is 8,000 miles in diameter. This sphere is spinning in space at 1,000 miles an hour, while simultaneously being unevenly heated by a fluctuating nuclear reactor located 93 million miles away. And you, the meteorologist, are expected to predict the exact physical state of that gas mixture at one specific street corner several days in advance.
When you put it like that, it's a miracle they get it right 50% of the time. It's an almost impossibly complex math problem.
And it highlights a chilling scientific reality that we briefly touched upon when we discussed the birth of Hurricane Ivan. We have all these satellites looking down at the Atlantic Ocean. We can identify the preconditions perfectly. We can see the high sea surface temperatures. We can measure the lack of wind shear. We can track the disorganized cluster of thunder cells drifting off the coast of Africa.
We know where the ingredients are, and we know when it might happen.
But the exact tipping point remains elusive. The precise, microscopic moment when a disorganized, chaotic cluster of storms crosses the thermodynamic threshold and organizes into a self-sustaining, monstrous vortex, that exact birth is invisible to us in real time. We only ever identify it through hindcasting. We look back at the satellite data hours after the structure is already formed and say, that is when it happened.
Wait, slow down. You're saying we literally cannot see the hurricane turn into a hurricane until after it's done it. Why is that threshold so invisible?
Because the atmosphere is the ultimate chaotic system. In mathematics and physics, chaos theory describes systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. This is the famous butterfly effect coined by Edward Lorenz. The idea that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can set off a cascade of atmospheric interactions that eventually result in a tornado in Texas. It is a nonlinear system. A tiny, immeasurable change in temperature or wind direction in one thunderstorm cell, perhaps caused by a goat eating a green shoot in Timbuktu and altering the evaporation rate of a single square foot of soil, can amplify through the system and dictate whether the storm dissipates harmlessly or spirals into a Category 5 hurricane.
And speaking of spirals, the wind fundamentally hates moving in straight lines, doesn't it?
Yes. In fluid dynamics, there is a concept called laminar flow, where a fluid moves in smooth, parallel layers with no disruption. Laminar flow is incredibly rare in the natural atmosphere. The moment air masses of different temperatures, densities, or speeds collide, or the moment wind encounters physical friction from a mountain range or a city skyline, the smooth flow breaks down. It creates turbulent flow. It fractures into swirling eddies. It forms vortexes.
And once you understand that the atmosphere is just a fluid trying to resolve pressure differentials, you realize that vortexes are everywhere. You start seeing them in your daily life. It's not just the terrifying macro examples like hurricanes and tornadoes. It's the little whirlpool of water spiraling down your bathtub drain. It's the Great Red Spot on Jupiter, which is just an anticyclonic storm that has been raging for centuries.
It is the smoke ring casually blown by someone sitting at a campfire.
Yes. Or it's the reason high-tension power lines sing or hum on a windy day. The wind is creating microscopic vortexes as it rushes past the cylindrical wire. It's the aerodynamic reason an amateur golfer slices their drive into the woods. The spin on the ball creates an asymmetric vortex wake that drags it off course. And here's one almost everyone has experienced without realizing the physics. It's the reason your flimsy plastic shower curtain billows inward and aggressively sticks to your wet legs when you take a hot shower.
Yes. The hot air inside the shower stall rises, creating a miniature zone of low pressure at the bottom. The cooler, denser air from the bathroom tries to rush in to equalize that pressure, pushing the curtain inward and creating a tiny, localized vortex in your bathroom.
It's the exact same thermodynamic engine as Hurricane Ivan, just scaled down to a fiberglass tub. Fluid dynamics are universal. Wow. But here's what really amazed me in the reading. Understanding that these vortexes, these storms actually travel, was a surprisingly recent revelation for humanity.
It speaks to a profound historical blindness. The book details the events of the Great Storm of 1703, which struck southern England.
This was a catastrophic event. It was documented meticulously by the journalist Daniel Defoe, who is most famous for writing the novel Robinson Crusoe.
Defoe acts as an early disaster journalist here. He cataloged the devastation with grim precision.
And the devastation was apocalyptic. He wrote about the heavy lead roof of Queen Anne's palace being caught by the wind and rolled up like a flimsy sheet of parchment paper. He documented 17,000 massive oak trees being uprooted in Kent alone. Witnesses described seeing a tornado embedded within the gale that looked like an immense elephant trunk, whipping across the countryside, snapping ancient trees in half. Thousands of sailors died as the Royal Navy fleet was smashed against the coast.
The country was traumatized. But the crucial takeaway from Defoe's extensive documentation wasn't the catalog of damage itself. It was the realization of what the populace didn't know. People knew exactly what had happened to them. They could measure the wind, they could count the dead, they could assess the ruined buildings, but they had absolutely zero idea why it was happening, or more importantly, that the storm had actually traveled hundreds of miles to reach them.
I always assumed people knew storms moved. You look out west, you see dark clouds, you know the storm is coming your way.
On a visual horizon, yes, but on a continental scale, the conceptual leap hadn't been made. The prevailing belief at the time was that storms simply materialized in place. They believed a storm was generated by localized vapors, it raged furiously over a specific town until it exhausted its energy, and then it vanished. The idea that a storm was a coherent, traveling entity, a distinct thermodynamic system born days earlier out over the Atlantic Ocean that was physically moving across the globe, was entirely absent from the public consciousness.
Why couldn't they put that together?
Because they lacked the infrastructure to perceive it. You cannot track the movement of a fast-moving storm system if your fastest mode of communication is a man riding a horse. By the time a messenger arrives in London from Cornwall to warn them of a gale, the gale has already been there for 2 days. It required the invention of the electric telegraph in the 19th century to create a global network of simultaneous data collection. Only when meteorologists could instantly compare barometric pressure drops in Paris, London, and Edinburgh at the exact same moment could they finally map the trajectory of a storm and prove that weather actually travels.
Which perfectly proves the underlying thesis of this whole crisis in perception. You literally cannot perceive the reality of a system until you invent the tools necessary to see it. Before the telegraph, weather was a localized punishment from God. After the telegraph, it was a moving thermodynamic system. And now that we have satellites and advanced atmospheric chemistry, we are uncovering new connections that are frankly unbelievable. Which brings us to the final and perhaps most vital section of our discussion, the ultimate feedback loops: dust, climate, and our future. Because the wind isn't just moving heat and water vapor around, it is physically moving the Earth itself.
And in doing so, it is tying completely disparate ecosystems together in a highly delicate, precarious web of dependency.
There is a massive reddish-brown river of dust that gets whipped up from the Baudelaire Depression and other dry lake beds in the Sahel region of Africa, the exact same area where our hurricane started. The easterly trade winds catch millions of tons of this incredibly fine, mineral-rich dust and carry it in a massive plume, hundreds of miles wide, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. And this African dust literally acts as an aerial fertilizer for the Amazon rainforest in South America.
It provides crucial phosphorus and other nutrients to a jungle soil that is otherwise surprisingly nutrient poor because the heavy rains constantly wash the minerals away. The lushness of the Amazon basin relies directly on the desolation of the Sahara.
The Amazon relies on the Sahara. It's an incredible planetary symbiosis. But there's a dark side to this feedback loop, isn't there? The book points out that this dust conveyor belt is carrying more than just minerals.
As the sheer volume of transported dust has increased over the last few decades, driven in part by worsening desertification, changing climate patterns, and aggressive agricultural practices in the Sahel, it has brought unintended microscopic hitchhikers.
Yes. Fungal spores, bacteria, and viral cysts attach themselves to the tiny dust particles. They ride the wind across the ocean, surviving the ultraviolet radiation of the high altitudes. And when this dust settles over the Caribbean Sea, these pathogens rain down into the water. Researchers like marine geologist Eugene Shin in Florida have definitively linked this atmospheric dust to the decimation of marine life. They proved that a specific strain of African soil fungus transported by the wind is directly responsible for the massive die-offs of sea fans and coral reefs across the Caribbean.
It is a devastating connection. A localized drought in an African desert is literally murdering coral reefs in the Bahamas. It perfectly illustrates that the atmosphere acts as a conveyor belt for the entire biosphere. You cannot damage one component without the ripple effects striking a seemingly unrelated ecosystem across the globe. And this reality brings us to the most critical existential feedback loop of all, the changing composition of the atmosphere itself and the greenhouse effect.
Let's take the time to really break down the mechanics of the greenhouse effect. We hear the term constantly in the news, but usually without a clear explanation of the physics. The ping-pong analogy in the text makes it so visceral and understandable. Walk us through it.
We begin with the incoming solar radiation. When sunlight hits the Earth, it easily passes through the atmosphere because it is short wavelength radiation. It strikes the surface, the land, and the oceans and warms them up. The Earth, now warmed, attempts to vent that heat back into the freezing void of space by re-radiating it. However, because the Earth is much cooler than the Sun, the heat it re-radiates is long-wavelength infrared radiation.
Wavelength changes when it bounces back up.
Exactly, and that change in wavelength changes how the energy interacts with the gases in the sky. In our natural atmospheric mix, there is a specific narrow band of frequencies, a transparent window spanning between 8 and 11 micrometers in wavelength, where this infrared heat can escape freely through the air and dissipate into space.
So the window is open, the heat escapes, the planet cools down.
Yes, but the heat radiating at other wavelengths is intercepted by greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor. These specific gas molecules are structurally designed to absorb that long wavelength infrared energy. When they absorb the heat, the molecules become highly agitated, they vibrate, and then they re-radiate that heat energy.
And here's where the ping pong game starts.
Precisely. When the agitated CO2 molecule re-radiates the heat, it sends it in all directions. Some of it goes out into space, which is fine, but a significant portion is bounced right back down toward the Earth. The Earth's surface absorbs that returned heat, warms up further, and re-radiates it back up towards space. Another CO2 molecule catches it, gets agitated, and bounces it back down again.
So it's a microscopic, high-speed game of ping pong happening trillions of times a second, with the heat continuously bouncing between the surface of the planet and the carbon dioxide in the sky, becoming trapped in the lower atmosphere.
That is the greenhouse effect. And a certain amount of this is vital. Without any greenhouse gases, the Earth's average temperature would be near 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and we would be an ice planet. But as human industrial activity pumps billions of tons of extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we are effectively adding trillions of extra ping pong paddles to the sky. More heat is intercepted, more heat is bounced back down, and the entire thermodynamic engine of the planet begins to run hotter and faster.
And the terrifying part of this is how the system might respond. Because as we discussed earlier, the climate isn't a simple linear machine, it's a chaotic system.
This is a crucial distinction. We often assume that as CO2 levels rise gradually, the temperature will rise gradually, giving us time to adapt. But chaotic systems are drawn toward what mathematicians and physicists call attractors.
Let's explain that term.
Think of the Earth's climate like a marble rolling around in a vast landscape of deep valleys. Those valleys are the attractors, stable states of equilibrium. Right now, our climate is stable, rolling around the bottom of the Holocene Valley. But if we push the marble hard enough, say, by injecting massive amounts of thermal energy via trapped greenhouse gases, it doesn't just slowly roll uphill. It starts oscillating wildly. And eventually, it might crest the peak of the valley and then violently, uncontrollably drop into a completely different valley.
A totally different attractor. And the book suggests there are other potential models for our planet that are much less hospitable.
Paleoclimatology shows us the Earth has inhabited different valleys before. There is the White Earth model, which is a deep freeze ice age where expanding glaciers reflect so much sunlight that the planet locks into a permanent winter. And on the other extreme, there is the Venus model, where the greenhouse effect runs so rampant that surface temperatures skyrocket, causing the oceans to literally evaporate, creating a suffocating, hyperdense atmosphere of steam and CO2.
And because it's a chaotic system, we might not get a century of polite, gradual warning before the marble drops. A small trigger, just a few extra parts per million of CO2 crossing an invisible threshold, could cause the entire system to flip from our current valley into a new attractor. It could bounce from the world we know to the White Earth or the Venus model in a matter of decades.
Flip, the deep freeze, or flip, the oceans boil. The speed of the transition is what makes it so dangerous. We have zero time to adjust our agriculture or move our coastal cities. But amidst all these dire climate models, there is one massive wild card that meteorologists are still fighting to understand, and that's the clouds.
Clouds are the greatest unresolved variable in climate science. They dictate the Earth's albedo, which is its reflectivity. We track this by measuring something called earthshine, the amount of sunlight that reflects off the Earth's cloud cover and illuminates the dark, unlit portion of the moon.
And the data they get from earthshine is wildly confusing. In the late 1980s and through the 90s, the Earth's albedo dimmed. We were reflecting less light, meaning more solar heat was penetrating to the surface, which perfectly correlated with the rising temperatures of global warming. But in more recent years, that trend suddenly reversed. The Earth got brighter, we started reflecting more light again. It raises a huge fundamental debate in the scientific community about what clouds actually do when the planet heats up.
Do clouds act primarily as a blanket, or do they act as an iris? That is the crux of the debate. If the oceans warm up, more water evaporates, creating more cloud cover. If those additional clouds act as a blanket, they will trap more of that ping-ponging infrared heat close to the surface, accelerating the warming in a positive feedback loop.
But the iris theory suggests the opposite.
Yes. The iris hypothesis, proposed by some climatologists, suggests that as the tropical oceans warm, the resulting cloud cover might act like the iris of a human eye reacting to bright light. It shrinks the area of high cirrus clouds, allowing more infrared heat to escape into space, while maintaining low-level clouds that reflect incoming sunlight away. In this model, the clouds act as a natural negative feedback loop, a planetary cooling mechanism that kicks in when the system gets too hot.
It is the single biggest source of error in our supercomputer climate simulations. We just don't know for sure which way the clouds will break. If they act as a negative feedback loop, it could mean the most catastrophic predictions of global warming are slightly exaggerated and the planet has a built-in safety valve. But if they act as a blanket, we are in much deeper, much faster trouble than we currently realize.
It highlights the precariousness of our position. We are altering the chemistry of a chaotic system that we do not fully understand, assuming the marble will simply stay in the valley.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a muddy puddle in Darfur, Sudan, and we ended up debating the evaporation of the oceans and the thermodynamic geometry of the planet.
It means, I hope, that we have successfully challenged the initial crisis in perception. We have taken the listener on a journey from viewing a drought in Africa as a localized anomaly to seeing it as the initial spark that alters atmospheric pressure, ignites a hurricane in Florida, fertilizes the soil of the Amazon, and inadvertently murders coral in the Caribbean. The atmosphere is not an empty void between the ground and the stars. It is a massive, heavy, breathing, balancing engine. When we finally shift our perspective from local, linear thinking to global, systems-level thinking, the apparent randomness of the weather fades away. It reveals a beautiful yet terrifying physical logic. Everything is physically tethered to everything else by the wind.
I love that summary. So a direct call to you, the listener. The next time you step outside your front door and feel a gentle breeze tickling the hairs on your forearm, or you get caught in a sudden, miserable, unpredictable downpour on your commute, don't just curse the local weather or check your phone app. Take a second to look up. Remember that you are standing at the absolute bottom of a towering 10-mile-high ocean of churning fluid. You are experiencing the very tail end of a violent thermodynamic chain reaction that was born on the boiling surface of the sun, shaped by the spinning iron core of the planet, and delivered directly to your doorstep. You are inside the machine.
And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final lingering question to ponder on your own. We've established that the Earth's atmosphere is truly a single, deeply interconnected planetary engine, where a drought in Africa dictates a hurricane in America. If that is true, how does this reality eventually force us to redefine our entire concept of national borders and sovereignty? In the near future, if one country successfully utilizes advanced technology to engineer its local weather, perhaps seeding clouds to stop a devastating drought within its own borders, but in doing so, inadvertently alters the atmospheric pressure gradients and unleashes a catastrophic, unnatural storm on a nation halfway across the globe, is that an act of nature or an act of war?
Wow. If a country steals the rain, who is responsible for the drought? That is a thought that will keep you up at night. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Remember to support us on Patreon if you want to keep exploring the systems that shape our reality. Until next time, keep looking up and try to see the invisible.